Namaste, good morning, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our Sunday morning service. Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityormamritam Gamaya Aviravirmaedhi Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mambhahi Nityam Tena Mambhahi Nityam. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Reach us through and through ourself, O Lord, and protect us evermore from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So this morning, I wish to speak again on Swami Vivekananda. I say again because last month I spoke on him in honor of his birth celebration in the middle of last month, according to the Western calendar, which is January 12th. And so the Sunday before the 12th, we had a worship of Swami Vivekananda, and then another Sunday I spoke on Swamiji. But his birth date, according to the Indian calendar, which follows the phases of the moon, where the month follows the phases of the moon, his birthday this year fell on February 4th, this past Thursday. So in honor of that, I want to speak on him again. Of course, in a sense, everything that I teach, whether in a lecture or in a class, is deeply influenced by Swami Vivekananda. I can't pretend that what I am teaching is his message, but I can certainly affirm that whatever I teach, it's based on my understanding of Swami Vivekananda, that he forms the very foundation of my understanding, whether my understanding is correct or erroneous. It's a sincere effort to reflect the thought of Swami Vivekananda. So this morning I wish to speak on the topic Swami Vivekananda's place in history. And the prayer, which most of you know and which is very common in the Hindu tradition, which I said at the beginning, Asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityor ma mritam gamaya, etc. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Reach us through and through ourself, O Lord, and protect us evermore from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. That really is a prayer fulfilled in detail by Swami Vivekananda. And that really is, in essence, his place in history. One who came as an answer to that whole prayer. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. And the continuation, reach us through and through ourself, and evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. So I want to speak, of course, in some detail about his place in history, but really it can be said that it is, and that his place in history is an answer to that prayer. Now, it's difficult at this point in time, 2021, 119 years after he passed away, it's difficult at this point to say much in detail about Swami Vivekananda's place in history because he was one of those who came for future ages, not just for 100 years. Most of us are forgotten within a few years of our death by the few people who knew us. The few people who knew us intimately, within a few years, we are forgotten. And then some people who had a great influence on history, they're remembered for a century or two, and then later they're in the history books, but that's about the extent of our awareness of them. But people like Swami Vivekananda, a rare world teacher, one who comes once in 500 or 1,000 years into the world, their influence continues for millennia. And so for us to say after 100 years, after he gave his message and gave the impulse of spiritual power and spiritual light to the world that he came to give, we haven't even yet begun to see the unfolding of that power and that light. Yes, there are organizations like ours around the world now dedicated to him and to his message. There's a whole wealth of literature written about him. If you go to India nowadays, unlike when I first went in 1971, if you go nowadays, you see statues of Swamiji all over the country. 30, 40, 50 years ago, that wasn't so, but now you find statues of him all over India. Institutions all over India named after him. But still, we're only seeing the very beginning, and it is so much a beginning that it's hardly even that. We haven't really begun to see the unfolding of the power which he brought. And so it's too early to say much, but yet even now some things are foreseeable. Foreseeable because what he brought and the things that we're beginning to see now are just a seed state. So seeing the seed state of things, we can project some things about the importance of the Swami. Understanding history and understanding the time when Swami Vivekananda came and understanding something of the message which he gave to address the times in which he came, and then seeing the seeds of his ideas beginning to develop in places, we can form some idea and project some sort of idea of his place in history. But to do that, we have to have an understanding of who Swami Vivekananda was, what type of person he was, again, because he's not a person who just came and gave a few ideas to the world and people take them up and develop some institutions, and after some time it gives way to something else. Many people over the 50-something years I've been involved and been a member of the Ramakrishna Mission, many people over that period of time have asked me or hinted to me that it's time for another Vivekananda, that we should have another Vivekananda now. Vivekananda is much needed now. But no, such people don't come century to century. Again, such people come at long intervals of time, and what they give takes centuries and centuries to work out. And the influence they brought lasts for millennia. So Swami Vivekananda himself was very interested in history. There were several studies that Swami Vivekananda was particularly interested in. One was history, another was philosophy, another was Sanskrit. And not just because of the language itself, but because Sanskrit is the repository of Indian culture through the millennia. And so these three subjects were of intense interest to him: history, philosophy, and Sanskrit. He also had an interest in science, though that was not something that he delved into himself as an intense study. He more looked at the trends within science, as people nowadays might study, not to become a scientist with just going into the laboratory and learning methods of research and or experimentation, etc., but someone who looks at the field of science as a field and studies the trends within it. So he had that sort of interest in science also, but a deep interest and involvement with history, philosophy, and Sanskrit. And he had deep insight. Here also we have to understand his place in history. I again mentioned that we have to understand something of who he was, that he wasn't just an ordinary person with an ordinary educated mind and he studied some things and so forth. No, he had a deep, penetrating intellect. He could see to the heart of any matter. He could see the extent of a field of knowledge, and he could see the depths of a field of knowledge. And so with history, he had a deep understanding of history. He knew the details of history, an amazing encyclopedic mind he had, retaining the essence of the things he read, and many times even the words that he had read. Remembering tremendous power of memory for all of that. And so he combined with that encyclopedic knowledge, he had a deep insight. For him, history was a living thing. It was not the dead past recorded in a book, but for him, history was living. History was living in the present age. And that's a well-known insight about history, that we are the result of history. So history is living in all of us. In the West, for instance, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome continue to live in Western civilization. The ancient civilization of the Jews as well. The Christian civilization continues to live in the West, even among those who are non-Christian. So history is something living, and Swami Vivekananda saw it as living. So he knew the trends of ancient history. He knew the periods of history and the developments within history, but he also saw it as a dynamic, living system that was influencing everything that we do now. And he saw the present as the seed of future history. So he saw it as one continuum from the ancient past going up into the present, bringing us to the present, and then projecting into the future. And because of his profound intellect, his deep insight into human nature, into the human mind, into human civilization, he was able to see trends which were unseen to others at his time, but he could see the trends that were at work under the surface of the world of his time, and how those trends would develop into the future and bring the future to us. So he had that deep insight. In fact, as I have sometimes said, and as I deeply believe, one of the principal parts Swami Vivekananda had to play in the play of Sri Ramakrishna, using that in the Vedantic sense of the play of God, that this whole universe is the play, the manifestation, the dance of God. And so there was the play of Sri Ramakrishna. He came to earth for a purpose, but a purpose not in the ordinary human sense of something that's done with great intention and consciously planning everything out. But no, it was the manifestation of the divine through Sri Ramakrishna and those associated with him. So Swami Vivekananda's part in that divine play, one of the essential parts of his part in the play, was that Sri Ramakrishna generated the tremendous spiritual power through his spiritual practice and his realizations, that intense life that he lived, in which Swami Vivekananda said he lived the whole history of the Indian civilization. The whole history of the civilization he lived in his one life and showed the way into the future. So that tremendous power which he generated through that intense life of his, Swami Vivekananda's part was to give direction to that power. Sri Ramakrishna himself couldn't do that. He needed Swami Vivekananda for that, because Sri Ramakrishna's mind was so absorbed in God that that idea of thinking about tomorrow, that he couldn't do. So he needed someone who had that capacity. And so Swami Vivekananda, who had the highest realization, and then Sri Ramakrishna drew a veil over that realization, something which is unknown in the religious history. Sri Ramakrishna drew a veil over Swami Vivekananda's realization, so that, as Sri Ramakrishna himself said, it was the thinnest of veils and could be rent at any moment. But It would stay in place until Swami Vivekananda finished his work, because Swami Vivekananda had to do work in this world which required a sense of agency. He required a highly informed mind, a profound mind, a mind which could, with a profound insight, but also which was deeply informed about the situation of the world. He had to look at the world and then figure out what the world needed and give direction to the power Sri Ramakrishna had brought for the good of the world. Again, that was one of the central purposes of of Swami Vivekananda in the play of Sri Ramakrishna. So he traveled through India after Sri Ramakrishna passed away. He traveled through India. He lived in the hut of the peasant. He lived in the palace of the king. He met the high and mighty of society, the movers and shakers of society, and he met the poorest and the most dispossessed of society. Traveling from north to south in India, spending time in different parts of India, studying the people, looking at the condition of the country, looking at the condition of the people. Because he had part of his work was the uplift of India. But then he traveled from India to the west, first going through Southeast Asia, through Malaysia, and then on to China and Japan, and then to Canada and the United States, and later to Europe and so forth, and then to Egypt and other places. All of this traveled through the world was also informing him about the state of the world, so that he had, again, a knowledge of the condition, the present condition of the world. And then he could apply the medicine which Sri Ramakrishna had brought, this tremendous spiritual power, apply that to the needs of the world with a direction to the future, so that it would help the whole of humanity. Because Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna were concerned with the uplift of the whole of humanity. They weren't concerned just with the spiritual aspirants, the few people like us who are interested in an intense spiritual life. They wanted the uplift of everyone, and they wanted that spirituality to be brought for the welfare of everyone. So Swami Vivekananda was always afraid that because of the past tendency in India, that tremendous power Sri Ramakrishna had brought, and not just India, but the religious tendency around the world, but as also manifested in India, that tremendous power which Sri Ramakrishna had brought to the world would be confined within the bounds of temple culture. That the power would be enshrined in temples, and people would come to temples and get blessed by the priests, or in our case, by the Swamis and so forth. They would be the guardians of the power of Sri Ramakrishna, and so it would be locked up within the confines of temples and monasteries. They didn't want that. They wanted that power to be spread for the welfare of all. So again, Swami Vivekananda traveled through India. He traveled through the world, studying the condition of the world, and not studying in an academic way, though he did read widely. One of the things I was amazed at during the years I was working on his complete works in India, from 2012 to the end of 2017, when I came here, was how widely Swamiji was read. We found references for the different things said by Swamiji in the complete works. And it's amazing to see how widely he read, with the references from all kinds of texts from around the world. So he had academic knowledge, but it wasn't primarily academic knowledge. It was deep insight, which he had acquired through his own spiritual development, his own spiritual insight, and the blessing of Sri Ramakrishna, his deep insight into human nature, the human mind, which gave him insight into the human condition, so that what he saw in front of him was not just a two-dimensional picture of a time slice in society. He could see into the conditions of his present society in India and around the world, and see how the world had come to that state, what had brought the world to the present state. And then again, because he saw the dynamism of history, he could see the tendencies which were working through his time and into the future. So he traveled through India, traveled through the world, and he had wide-ranging interest in everything to do with humanity. In fact, he was the first great world teacher, and so we can therefore say he's the only great world teacher that we find who had that wide-ranging interest in everything that human beings had done, all human accomplishments, all fields of human greatness and human endeavor. The religious teachers of the past have given a teaching about the spiritual path, about the reality to be attained, how to attain it, and then told people just focus on this, forget everything else. But Swami Vivekananda, again, was interested in history. He was interested in civilization, interested in culture, interested in language, interested in science and scientific achievement, interested in philosophy, interested in all kinds of fields of human interest. In fact, he said on one occasion that, you see, I may have to be reborn, for I have fallen in love with man. Again, that statement based on that Indian idea that what you focus your mind on in your lifetime, that will have a powerful influence on your next birth. And so for a high spiritual aspirant like Swami Vivekananda, the goal is to keep the mind fixed only on God, so that at the end of life, we go to God and there's no more rebirth. We attain to realization, enlightenment, and remain in a state of infinite identity with the infinite. But Swami Vivekananda said that, you see, I may have to be reborn again because I have fallen in love with man, with humanity. So he was, again, the first great world teacher who took such wide-ranging interest in human affairs. So what did he find? I want to deal with two different areas that could be expanded out, but time is limited. And I've already got twice as much material as I can possibly cover in one lecture. So, so I'll have to be brief on some of these. So deal with what he found about India and what he found about the West. Why the West? Because as was beginning to happen then, and he foresaw that it would continue as it has, Western culture through colonialism would spread around the world and influence cultures all over the world. He didn't think that that was necessarily good. He thought that each culture is sacred and each culture has its own inner life and should be free to grow according to its own inner law of growth. But he saw that this was happening and would continue to happen. And we find that that is true. Every corner of the world is culturally colonized, in some cases politically, but at least and economically, but at least culturally colonized by the West. So what he found about India was that, for one thing, India had been subjugated for 1,000 years, first by the invasions coming from Central Asia and the Middle East, the expansion of Islam into India, which subjugated India, and then the coming of the British, of course. And so for almost 1,000 years, India was a slave nation. And so he saw that due to that, there were various consequences of that, but let me point to several that he drew out as especially important. One thing was that because of that subjugation, India became very conservative, religiously, culturally, extremely conservative. In a sense, India has always been conservative, and I don't mean in a political sense, but in a cultural sense, in that everything that has happened in India has been preserved, even the most ancient practices and rites. There's some people in India somewhere who are still carrying on those. And so India, in that sense, has always been culturally conservative. But in a more intense way, that happened because of India's subjugation. If you were under attack by someone, then your tendency as an individual is to curl up to protect your vital organs. And so if a culture is under attack, but it's able to survive, it survives by keeping itself protected. And that protection is conservatism, to hold on to the basic ideas and teachings of the culture so that they're not destroyed, because they are under attack. And they were under attack for 1,000 years, active attack for 1,000 years. Periods where it was less, but under some attack for 1,000 years. So Hindu society had become very conservative. As a result, in India, you found, and you still find even today, one of the problems Swamiji pointed to again and again, which is little recognized, but when I study Swamiji's complete works, I find it on page after page when he's speaking about India. The fact that India had become highly repetitive. Rather than looking out at the world with a fresh mind and seeing what can be experienced, what can be learned, what can be inquired into, there's the tendency even now of just repeating the past, all of the old definitions, the old sayings, the old texts and so forth, just repeating that, even without understanding it, just going on repeating the same old things. Sister Nivedita, Swamiji's brilliant Irish-English disciple who dedicated herself to India, said that India had been harmed by the very perfection of her definitions. That is, the idea became that the ancients have already solved all of the problems, so there's nothing for us to think. There's nothing for us to inquire into. I once heard a great Ayurvedic physician of India. I went to a seminar of his. I won't mention his name, but a great Ayurvedic physician who was asked during the seminar, is there any experimentation going on with Ayurveda now to further the principles and learn for new applications and so forth? And so he said, Ayurveda is a perfected system. It was perfected thousands of years ago. There's nothing to add to it. There's all one does now and should do, all you can do legitimately, is to read the old texts and master them. No, 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 no. That's the problem. That's the problem, that in every field in India you find that became and still is largely the attitude that everything was perfected in the past, so just go on repeating what the past did. No, certainly in Ayurveda, the great principles of Ayurveda that were discovered, those may be true, and but there's always new application. There's always learning new details, learning new ways of understanding. And so with all fields. So Swami Vivekananda, you see again and again, he was telling people in India to look at things afresh. He said, the sages of old are dead as doornails. He used that English expression, dead as doornails. You must be sages yourself. You must be the new sages. So that constant appeal to look at the world afresh and to give up the old definitions, not to give up the principles, the great principles discovered, but to get out of this cage of the mind which says that everything has already been done by the ancients, so just read their books and recite what they said, even without understanding it, and that itself is considered wisdom. No, that's not wisdom. So that was one of the things he discovered. Another thing he discovered was the terrible loss of pride of Hindus in India because of British education. And that was quite deliberate. Not on the part of every English person who was a school teacher, but it was deliberate on the part of the government as a whole and many individuals within it. And others just followed and did the same thing, that is, destroying the Hindu pride in their own civilization and instilling a love for everything British and European. And so that had denationalized the country. So for one thing, he saw the country had been enslaved for 1,000 years. It had become conservative. It had become highly repetitive. And then its pride in its great ancient past had been destroyed. So you'd seen that, again, India had withdrawn within itself. And so ideas like the prohibition against crossing the Kalapani, the ocean, that was an old prohibition, but that became stronger. India at one time had a great trade. In fact, even now, I've been to Bahrain, and there in the Bahraini National Museum of Bahraini history, you find a big exhibit at the beginning of Bahraini history, how there was trade between Vedic civilization and Bahrain. And India had trade with China and with other countries of the world, all the way up to the Mediterranean world. And yet, again, India withdrew within itself. As Tibet, not as extreme as Tibet, but similar to Tibet, it withdrew within itself, thinking that it was all sufficient to itself and didn't need the external world. Swamiji said that that was one of the causes of India's downfall. As the Dalai Lama has said about Tibet, that it was the cause of Tibet's downfall. The idea that we don't need the outside world, we can close ourselves off from the outside world, and we can just live in the bubble of our own culture. Swami Vivekananda wanted people to go out from India, as they are doing now, not just as immigrants, but now Indians are tourists going and seeing other countries and so forth. Swamiji wanted that, for people to go out and see other cultures, what other people were doing. So that knowledge would come back to India and enrich and enliven the culture. So again, it's seen as part of that conservatism that India had withdrawn within itself. He saw that superstition had replaced the grand principles of Indian civilization. One of the things he found, which I'll mention again when I come to the West, one of the things he found was that India had discovered great principles, universal principles, in spiritual life and in other fields of inquiry as well. Great principles, but those had been largely forgotten, and the common practice in India had become one of village custom and superstition. And so that he lamented also, as well as addressing it. He found that casteism had taken over India. Swamiji saw a value in the principle of caste, but not in casteism. And he saw that casteism had taken over India. And as a result, the inequality, the restriction of culture only to the highest classes, and the rest of society was prohibited from the riches of Indian culture. And the lower classes were the majority of the population. So the large part of the population was dispossessed and not given access to the riches of their own culture. There was no equality of opportunity. And because the majority population was denied access to the cultural richness of Hinduism, they also could not contribute to it. Swami Vivekananda saw that one of the greatnesses of the West, and particularly of America, was, though I'm afraid America can't be so proud now, but it was in his time, that education and culture were spread among all of the masses. And so he saw that a country like America could raise great men and women from the whole population. But in India, he found that culture was restricted to the few. And so it's only among those few that you get great contributions, because the rest are not only denied culture, but they're not available for contributing to the culture as well. And so you get the degeneration of culture itself. And then he saw the loss of humanity and self-confidence, the very sense of humanity among the low castes of India. He found that they no longer even believed in their own humanity. And so these were some of the problems. Also, the treatment of women in India, he found that that was a cause of degeneration in the country. But there were great positive things which made him, as he said, the proudest man alive, proud to be Indian, proud to be Hindu, etc. And so he found that the solution to India's problems were within India itself. It wasn't that the great white savior from England was necessary to come save India from itself. No, they didn't come to save India, they came to plunder India. As some of the more honest ones recognized, even in the government, Her Majesty's government recognized and stated that we're not here to help, we're here to take things from India. So he saw that India had the solutions to its own problems within herself, and he also saw that India had solutions to the problems of the world through her religion itself. That he found that the great religion of the Upanishads, the Vedanta, that it was a religion founded on principle, not on a person, not on a particular history, not on particular cultural practices, not on a ritual, not on a mythology, but on universal principles. And therefore, it could serve as the foundation for spirituality around the world. And these were the grandest principles in the world, principles beyond which you can't go. You can't go beyond non duality. Once you have realized and become the infinite, where else are you going to go? You are everything. You are infinite, no end to your being, to who you are. Where are you going to go after that? And so the Upanishads were discovered the highest principles of religion. And he found that that could serve, again, as the basis of a universal spirituality. Whether one practices Christianity or Islam or Buddhism, it doesn't matter. On the foundation of these Upanishadic principles, all of these other religions could be understood. Their religious practices could be understood. So he also found that India, through all of the vicissitudes of its several millennia long history, it had held to God, held to spirituality. And that, he felt, was why India had survived, whereas other great countries, great civilizations had grown, developed, had long golden periods, and then they disappeared and are known only as names in history. But India had continued because she had held on to the eternal, held on to God, held on to the eternal truth. And so India, he saw, was even in his time a repository of spiritual wisdom and spiritual power. And he saw in that the salvation of the world. And he also saw that in spite of the fact that India was tired, culturally exhausted, after millennia of great cultural activity, long cultural activity and great cultural activity in many different fields, not just spirituality, though spirituality was always the central core. But India, like a living organism, had become culturally tired and was in a moribund state in his time because of that. But he saw that there was still great vitality within the core of the culture, and that would come back, that would wake up again. In fact, he says in places, the great giant is awakening once again. I don't think that I am saying this, I see it. The great giant is awakening, meaning India. So the state of the West, briefly, what he saw when he traveled the wider world, and particularly the years he spent in America and England and Europe. And he saw, as I said before, that quickly the state of the West was becoming the state of the world because of cultural colonialism. In his time, political colonialism through the British, but eventually American colonialism, which was even more successful than the British, wasn't primarily political. It was economic colonialism and cultural colonialism. And so every corner of the world practically is influenced now. So in the state of society, he saw rampant materialism, that spirituality had declined to such a point in the West through the ascendance of science. And he was a great admirer and lover of science as an approach. But he saw that because Western science had taken a materialistic basis, it was founded in a materialistic view of life, and promoted that view as the end of life, that it had caused the spread of a rampant and repugnant sort of materialism, where gold and sex were the two ideals of the majority of people. Yes, people all through history have sought to enrich themselves, and they have sought to enjoy physical enjoyments as well. That's why in Hinduism it's recognized that there are four legitimate aims of life, which include those two. But that they had always been bridled by societies all around the world. I remember back in the early 1970s, whoever at that time was the head of the American I forget whether it was a psychiatric association. It was more probably the psychological association, psychology or psychoanalysis or some such national or international body, said that we must now recognize that there is a reason why all societies around the world have always had taboos around sexuality. It's because it's the greatest force in human life, other than the one superior force, which is spirituality. But when spirituality is clouded, then there's no force in human life as strong. And unless that is contained in some way and directed in legitimate channels, then it becomes obsessive. And that's what you see in the modern world. The whole world has become obsessed with sexuality. That has become the blinding obsession of the world now. And so Swamiji saw that the hunger for wealth and the hunger for carnal pleasure, that those two things had deluded the world, that they were unbridled and were causing great harm. So he found that there was no higher spiritual ideal or foundation for civilization in the West. So he saw the state of religion, that was moribund in the West, that the old myths were no longer believable. Yes, even today in 2021, there are many people in America who do not accept evolution. They think that the world was created, the universe was created in 6 literal days by God, and the literal process mentioned in the book of Genesis in the Bible. But that is not going to last, because you can't believe in foolishness forever. When the facts are clearly available to people, yes, you may stubbornly cling to old mythologies for some time, but in time you'll have to face the facts. You can't deny them forever. And so these are backwaters. This fundamentalism in Christianity, in Islam, and other religions, this fundamentalism is a backwater. Fear of the future, fear of the present and fear of the future is going to die. So Swamiji saw that the old religion was dying, and it could no longer hold the allegiance of thinking men and women. And with the death of religion comes the death of spirituality, comes the death of higher idealism. And so that's the destruction of society. As Arnold Toynbee, the British historian, showed. Some people disagree with his finding, but I certainly agree with it. It's hard to deny it. He said that until the 20th century, with movements like communism and fascism, all through the history of humanity, back to the caveman, we find religion at the center of every civilization. No civilization has been able to stand without religion at its center. And now when the world civilization is giving up religion to a large extent, civilization itself is in danger. And so he saw that. He saw the state of morality, that morality in the West was, again, I'm speaking specifically of the West and as well as the influence of the West on the rest of the world. He saw that in the West, morality was based on the traditional Judeo-Christian idea and the Abrahamic idea, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. That morality is a contract between God and humanity. God gave the 10 Commandments to humanity through Moses and asked people, these are my laws, you must follow them. And if you don't follow them, you're disobeying me, God. And so morality was seen as a contract between God and humanity. If you take God and the myths around the stories of the Bible, if you take them away and you no longer believe in them, then where's the foundation for morality? Utilitarians and humanitarians and others have sought a secular basis for morality, but there really is none. That's the sad truth. Yes, there are people who are atheists who are very, very moral, but that is because there's some sort of holdover from a time when they or others around them or their family had spiritual values and instilled these values. But through time, that doesn't hold up. Because why should I not steal if it makes me happy and if I can get away with it? Why should I not cheat if it makes me happy and I can get away with it? Why should I not lie if I can get away with it? You can't give me any believable reason if I want to do those things, short of a spiritual reason that is actually hurting me, because I'm going against my own spiritual nature and my connection to the universe, which is a spiritual connection. Short of that, there's no reason for being moral. And so, yes, there are people who are moral, who don't believe in God, but that's past momentum. It won't last through generations. And so Swamiji saw that, the state of morality. He saw the state of philosophy, that which explains life to us, which makes life meaningful. Religion makes life meaningful in one way, an important way, a true way. Philosophy in another way, a way which is communicable to people, which is understandable by the rational mind without appeals to sacred texts and sacred traditions and so forth. And so that's the value of philosophy. And he saw that the state of philosophy was also moribund in the West. And that we see as even more true today, where philosophy is basically just the handmaiden of science. It's given up the real thrust of philosophy to science. Let science figure things out, and we'll just deal with the proper ways of thinking about the things that are discovered. And so the state of philosophy of metaphysics has been practically destroyed. He saw the very concept of time in the West, the sense of linear time, which comes from the Abrahamic traditions. There was though in Judaism, there was actually the possibility of believing in cycles. But in Christianity and Islam, creation starts at a point, an absolute beginning. There's a continuous evolution to an end point, and that's the final end point. And so that has influenced all thought in the West, scientific thought, technological thought, Marxist thought. All thought has become linear. And so Swamiji saw the damaging ideas of that concept of time. He saw the possibility of the rise of fundamentalism and so forth also. He saw that, and therefore he preached a continual message of harmony and the foundations for harmony. He saw that the philosophy of work no longer worked. The Western philosophy of work, Western civilization, modern civilization was built on what's called the Protestant work ethic. But that's no longer believable. The Protestant work ethic has outrun its usefulness. I won't go into what it is. You can look it up on the internet and easily find it if you don't know. But the Protestant work ethic, which led to the great developments of modern Western civilization, that's no longer a living foundation. Nobody believes it except for backwaters of people. And so he saw that there was a new need for a new philosophy of work. He saw the religions fighting with each other, philosophies fighting with each other, cultures fighting with each other. So he wanted to find a basis for the needed diversity in the world. He saw that diversity is needed in all areas. So what did he do? In general, Swamiji opened windows and doors to humanity. He didn't give a set of definitions and a set of principles. You need to believe these things in order to be in tune with truth, and then everything will be okay. Do these practices, believe in these things, say this creed, follow this creed, and these moral laws, and everything will be okay. No, he didn't do that. He opened windows and doors to the minds of humanity, to the light that is everywhere, to the light of knowledge which is everywhere. He didn't give definitions and systems. He didn't develop rituals that everyone was to follow, that which founders of other religions have done, giving the rituals which become the foundation for their religious movement and so forth. And he gave something for everyone, not just for the spiritually inclined. He gave something for humanity at large. So what he gave to India, brief, and then in brief what he gave to the West. He saw the need for awakening, and he saw that with the advent of Sri Ramakrishna, also the advent of the Holy Mother, and though he wouldn't generally talk about it, with his own advent, with the advent of these three, one of the purposes of their advent was the reawakening of India. Why India? Because Swamiji saw that the reawakening of India, the strengthening of India, was important to the whole world. Swamiji wasn't a narrow nationalist. He loved India and saw the central importance India had to the world. But he loved India because he saw her important to the whole world. With their advent, the awakening of India was beginning. He said he saw it, and we see it even more now. And so when people just today, I got an email from somebody asking me about a problem in India, the protests with the farmers and everything, asking me what I thought about it and what's the solution and what are we going to do. And this side says this and that side says that. My solution to that is easy. The problem is already solved. We don't have to bother with it. Swami Vivekananda saw that the great giant is awakening, and as it awakens, it's going to shake, and as we do when we get out of bed. Our getting out of bed is not pretty. We get out of bed, we yawn, maybe burp, we rub our eyes, we have to go to the bathroom and everything. That's part of the waking up process. We have to brush our teeth, to take a shower, all of that. But we're waking up. And so the country of India is awakening also. And so, yes, leave India to India. Let India solve its own problems. It will work out its own problems. The worst thing that we can do is to go make pronouncements that, well, India should be doing this and India should be doing that, and these people should shut up and those people should sit down and these people should be listened to, when we don't know a damn thing. And so admit that we don't know, and we don't know what's going on. And Swami Vivekananda said the solution to all societies, not Indian, but all societies' problems, is to give them life-giving ideas and let them absorb those ideas in their own way and digest them and live them. And so those ideas are already there. They are already there in India. Those will take root. Those will begin their work. And yes, there'll be this reaction and that reaction and this thing will happen. And we don't even know. Maybe this one is good, maybe it's bad. Maybe that one's better, maybe it's worse. We don't know. We can't see, as Swami Vivekananda could see, the tendencies and how they were leading into the future. So stand back and let India wake up. Let India find itself. All of these problems in India are because India is finding itself. India as a whole doesn't need to find itself, but the society, the people within society, the parts, the cells of society, they are finding themselves, finding their way. Let them find their way. We don't have to make pronouncements. So he found that there was a need in India for a restatement of the eternal principles of India, because again, he found society had collapsed into superstition and village custom rather than the grand universal principles. So that he gave a new statement, as Sister Nivedita says in her beautiful introduction to the complete works. That he gave a statement of what Hinduism is, which future generations of mothers will teach their children when children ask, what is our Dharma? He saw that there was a need for the awakening of the mind from the deathly repetition of the past, just repeating the same things without even understanding the past. The awakening of the mind. And so that he constantly harped on that need. He saw the principle of the Atman, the divine self within everything, the divinity of all things and the divinity of each being. He saw that as a solution to the inequalities and inequities in Indian society. That we don't need to go with the reformer who's trying to fix particulars. No, give the teaching of the Atman to all. Wake up the consciousness of the divine self within all, within the high, low as well as within the high. And people will learn to manifest it. And that will itself cure the inequalities of Indian society. He taught the worship of God within all. He asked Sister Nivedita to institute the practice among her young Brahmin girl students. The first students in the Nivedita's girls' school were Brahmin girls. And so he wanted them to take beggars from the street and worship them as God, to literally offer worship to them, to bring them in, to give them a chance for a bath, for clothing, good food, and then to literally worship them as God, to instill this idea that God is in the high and the low both. So he saw that vision of the divine within all as the solution to many of India's social problems. He worked for the uplift of women also. He said that he said, using his words, I was born for the uplift of women and the masses. I, Swami Vivekananda, was born for the uplift of women and the masses. And so he worked nonstop for that. He said that the riches of Indian culture should be spread freely. He called upon the Brahmins of India, who were the traditional repository of the highest culture in India. He said, you must spread it freely among all, high and low alike. Give the riches of Indian culture to everyone. If you don't, he said, they will step on your throat and grab it out of your hands. And that's what's happening today. He said, if you don't give it to them freely, then they themselves will step on your throat and grab it from your hands. So why not be the benefactors of society? He said, the riches are always collected for what? For wider distribution. So the riches of Indian culture were always meant for distribution to the many. So you've kept it to yourselves. Now the time has come when you have to give it to all or it will be stolen from you. And so he wanted India also to rejoin the community of nations. And so though in his time, his traveling to foreign countries was highly criticized, it opened the way for religious teachers and common Indians to freely go outside of India, travel outside of India, and so that India could rejoin the community of nations. And he said that India must be a contributor, not a beggar, not go to the world as a beggar, as a poor nation that we need your help. You please give us some money. You please invest in us. No. You go to the world as a giver. And what India still has in his time, what India still had, was her spirituality. Go out to the world and give it freely. Distribute your spirituality freely, liberally, with an open heart and an open hand. And he knew that freedom would come to India, and that in time, India's rise was guaranteed. So now, a little bit about the West, what he gave to the world. One thing, of course, central was Indian spirituality. He saw that that was the solution to the world's problems. That religion had always been like a closed system, one religion fighting with another. But he saw that spirituality is universal, and spirituality doesn't pay homage to any culture. Spirituality can be practiced in any culture. And so because India had discovered the principles of spirituality. Other religions had dwelt on particular teachings and particular ideas and a particular founder who stated things in a particular way. But India had discovered the very principles, universal principles of spirituality, which could be applied in any culture, and not just in a culture, but in religious culture, any religious culture as well. So he wanted these principles to be given to the world, not imposed on the world as missionaries have done in the past, missionary religions have done, but offered to the world for people to take and use as they like. He presented a new ideal to the world in himself and in his teachings, a grand positive ideal of spiritual liberation. As Swamiji said, in the West, every person walks around with a church on top of their head, and on top of that, a book. By that, he meant that the church was, that religion in the West had become a domineering, authoritarian, hierarchical instrument of oppression. And the book on top of the church, meaning that you had to believe in the book. You had to believe in the book as the limitation of truth, that all truth is contained within the limits of the book. So he said that no book, not even the Veda, can contain the infinite truth. So he defined Veda not as the four Vedas that are recorded in text. He revered those as extremely important, but he realized that truth can never be confined within the volumes of a book or the bounds of a book or even within a library. So he said that Veda means the infinite repository of spiritual knowledge is meant by Veda. And so he saw that in the West, people were under the oppression of religious authority and the authority of a book. And so he gave a new vision, a new idea of what spirituality is, and a new, a grand and positive ideal, an ideal of the freedom of the mind, freedom of the spirit. At the social level, he recognized the divinity of all. And so he gave a new spiritual foundation for the movement of democracy, which he saw had taken new birth in America and was spreading around the world. And we see it still spreading around the world. Not American democracy, but the ideal of democracy, which got new birth in America in modern times. So by teaching the divinity of all, he gave the spiritual foundation for the view of the equality of all beings. All men are created equal. All men and women are created equal, as the founding document of America says. And so he gave the spiritual foundation for that. He gave, again, a new vision of freedom, where freedom doesn't mean primarily freedom to choose among an infinite variety of consumer items. That's no freedom at all. He believed in social freedom, in intellectual freedom, in physical freedom. He saw all levels of freedom were important, but real freedom comes at the higher level of the higher mind. The ability not to be affected by anything. That is true freedom. And so he taught that that is attainable. And the social freedoms, which he approved of in general, the social freedoms, that those were important until a person took to spiritual life. But then a person realizes that no, the realm of freedom is far above what kind of breakfast cereal I'm going to buy, or what kind of home I'm going to buy, and what kind of city I want to live in, and so forth. No, there's an infinite freedom which is attainable, and so he gave that ideal, but he rooted it in an acceptance of the needs of the common people who were not yet spiritual. That is, he said there must be physical freedom, there must be intellectual freedom, there must be social freedom, etc. He recognized that those levels of freedom were necessary also before a person can realize that, oh, the real realm of freedom is internal. Let me go there. So he gave a new view of the universe, a new view of time. I've spoken on that other occasion, so I won't develop these ideas now. A new view of matter, where matter is just an appearance of spirit. That matter is not the primary reality. Spirit is the reality, and matter is an appearance of the spirit. An appearance of the spirit, yes. And he gave a new philosophy of work in his karma yoga. Some people have said that his karma yoga was one of his greatest contributions. But through karma yoga, he gave a new view of work that is completely free of the Protestant work ethic, which basically said, just so it's not a mystery, basically said that if you work hard and are successful, that's a sign of God's grace. But in society where the belief in an old biblical God is only held by a minority of people, and even among them, there are only a few who hold it perhaps sincerely, that's no longer a foundation for work. It never was a very good one, and it's none at all for modern humanity. So Swamiji gave a new idea of work. Where work is self-realization. Through work properly done, we both come to freedom and we come to self-actualization and self-realization. He gave a new view of society itself, that society is an organism, that society is a living organism, just as I, as my physical being, made up of a vast number of individual cells, and each cell seeking its own life, going through its own life processes. But together they form my body. And then I have a consciousness which is superior to just the collection of cells. There's a unity to my being, in spite of the body being made up of variety. So, society, the individuals living within society are the cells of society, but the society has a unity to itself. It has its own life, it has its own purpose, it has its own immune system, so that when society becomes sick, it tries to heal itself. It has its own will to live, will to survive. It has states of health, it has states of sickness, and societies oftentimes die and disappear, which we see through history. History is replete with instances of dead societies. So it's a living system which has its own ideal and its own genius. Each society has its own ideal. He saw that in India, the ideal was God. The ideal was the realization of God, the realization of the infinite. In America, he found that the ideal was democracy. And so in every country, there is an ideal which is its very heart. And so he said that each society must follow its own line of growth. You can give it food as you give plants, food and water and a good environment, but the growing has to take place by the plant. And so he was against all forms of colonialism, whether it's political colonialism, military colonialism, economic colonialism, cultural colonialism. He was against all of it. He said that if a country could be proven to be totally evil, he said that's impossible, but even theoretically or hypothetically, say you find a culture that is completely evil, even then it should be left alone to follow its own law of growth, because through folly also comes wisdom. Through foolishness also comes wisdom. And so we have to learn to leave people alone and leave cultures alone. And that, of course, is a message especially needed in America at the governmental level, and is needed in the West in general in particular. Other countries may need it also, as other countries are coming up and becoming more powerful in the world, but it certainly is essential that we learn it here, because of the harm that we have done and the potential harm we will continue doing in the future. So he said, give a culture life-giving ideas in the form of principles, and let the country work those principles out in its own way. Again, he saw that missionary religions had the tendency, with the exception of Buddhism to some extent. Even Buddhism to some extent did this, but much less. But missionary religions of Christianity and Islam especially, that Islam went from country to country and wanted everyone to become Arabic, basically. And European Christianity went everywhere and wanted everyone to become a little European. So he didn't want that. He didn't want a culture, even Indian culture, to dominate the world, because diversity is at the root of life. He said that sameness at the level of manifestation means death. The sameness at the level of spirit, that is life, that is infinity. That's what gives diversity its background of unity. But at the level of diversity, diversity is essential. There must be diversity of languages. There must be diversity of philosophies, diversity of religions. That the effort, he said, to make all people think alike would end in the death of thought itself. Is diversity of thought, the clash of one thought against another, which makes, that awakens thought, that makes people thoughtful. So with cultures, the diversity of cultures is necessary. He said when he traveled through Eastern Europe in 1900, he said that he saw everywhere people wearing the same clothes, eating the same food, doing the things in the same way. That is, he saw European culture spreading and sort of homogenizing other cultures. Whereas Europe previously, each country had its own distinct culture, distinct native dress and everything. But gradually that was becoming homogenized. He said that is the sign of death. And so he taught the foundation of diversity is the recognition of the unity already existing. People are crazy about unity and they want to enforce unity on the world. No, Swamiji saw we don't need to enforce unity. We have to recognize the unity which is already there. There's one reality, one truth, one reality, but it manifests itself in infinite variety. If I recognize the unity, I don't have to fear the variety. Unity doesn't mean get rid of variety. Unity means recognizing the ever-existent, non-dual truth which has never been hidden, never been obliterated. We've just overlooked it. Something within us has chosen to overlook it. And so by recognizing a unity in diversity, then the diversity itself, we see the beauty of diversity and the place of diversity. So this is a very brief, you may say I've gone on for a long time, but actually it's a very brief statement of some of the important points, as I see them, of Swami Vivekananda's important place in history. So I'll end by saying that the very most important thing that Swamiji did, of all of the many things he did, was that he worked at the very foundation of human society itself. Worked is the wrong, brings up the wrong interpretation of what I'm saying, but I don't have a better word for it, because his work was through the intensity of his deep perception of the truth and his recognition of the truth. It was through that recognition with his powerful mind that he planted that at the heart of society, and that will go on working. And he himself said that he would go on working. What does it mean? He said that it may be that I'll find it best to get rid of this body, to cast it off like a worn-out garment, but I shall not cease working. I shall continue working until the world will know that it's one with God. So what did he mean by working? Not that he's sitting somewhere in a higher world doing things and looking, okay, move this here, move that there, build this here, do that there. No. Working at the level of Swami Vivekananda is not like that. Working at his level is at the level of the seed of thought, giving that life-giving thought with such power, which only a world teacher, like a Vivekananda, a Ramakrishna, a Buddha, a Jesus, a Krishna, has, giving that thought with such power that it begins to work itself out in society. It begins to manifest itself in society. And so he worked at the depths of human society by establishing there a new idea, a new ideal, a new interpretation of everything within society based on the principles of the Vedanta. And that would go on working within society for the benefit of the many, for the happiness of the many. And so that is where the root of his place in history is, at the very foundation of society. So with that, I will close. I've once again gone on longer than the usual time, so I won't ask for questions today. I'll give announcements and then the closing prayer. So this month we will have all of our usual activities. They're all scheduled as normal. No special celebrations this month. Next month, March, we have Shivaratri and Ramakrishna's birthday. But this month it will go as usual in the ordinary course of things, with the Tuesday evening classes on the Gita at 7:30, the Thursday morning classes on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna at 11 o'clock, and all of them live streamed, and Sunday services every week. And so next week I will speak on basic concepts of Vedanta, and the concept I will deal with in this series on this coming Sunday is knowledge, jnana. What does knowledge mean from a Vedantic standpoint? So with that, I'll give a closing chant. Om madhuvatarayate madhuksharanti sindhavaha madhvirnasantoshadhihi madhunaktamutoshasi madhumatparthivagum rajaha madhudyaurastu nah pita Madhumandho vanaspatir madhumagum astu suryaha madhvirgavo bhavantu naha. Om Madhu, Om Madhu, Om Madhu. For us who seek the truth, and for all living beings, may the winds blow sweetly, may the rivers flow sweetly, may the herbs yield us sweetness. Sweet be the night and the break of day, sweet be the very dust of the earth. May the trees, lords of the forest, bear us sweetness. May the sun shed its sweetness upon us. May all the directions pour forth sweetness. Om, sweetness, sweetness, sweetness.